This is a production of Cornell University.
So I'd like to thank you all for inviting me here today and to you all for coming and actually listening to me. As Neil mentioned, you did tell me there hadn't been invasive species talks in a while. And I was actually told at some other conferences that sometimes they don't invite the invasive species people because they only talk about doom and gloom, overwhelming problems, and there aren't really any good solutions to those problems. So the title of my talk today, Invasive Species Challenges and Solutions in New York State, I am going to outline a lot of the problems, some of the species we have here, but I also want to talk a little bit, actually a lot, about what we're doing here in New York State to address those problems. We are actually really ahead of the game here, and I've worked out of the country for 11 years, and it was so refreshing to come back and see a situation with the resources and the right people in their positions to actually accomplish something for conservation and for improving natural resources management. So I will get started with that. And for those of you, I see Betsy in the back there. And for those of you who know a lot about invasive species, just bear with me. I wasn't really sure of the level of knowledge that you all have on invasives, and I wanted to make sure we're all on the same page before I dove into more specifics. So I'd like to start by making sure that we all are speaking the same language about invasive species, because there's a lot of different terms that we see thrown around when we're talking about species that are native: introduced, non-native, exotic, alien, weeds, nuisance, pests, non-indigenous. And so what we're talking about is we're talking about species that are introduced, they're new to an environment, and they're problematic, and that's what we call invasive species. So here in New York State, we follow the national definition for invasive species, and it's a species that's not native to the ecosystem under consideration, and whose introduction causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And to be considered invasive, it actually has to have negative impacts that significantly are greater than the benefits. And so just really quick, when we're thinking about native species, we're thinking about species that have developed over hundreds or thousands of years in a particular region. And so usually native has like a geographic qualifier, like native to New York, native to North America, and so on. And usually we only count species as native if they were here before European settlement. What's a non-native species? Well, it's a species that comes from a different place and is arrived through human activity, deliberately or accidentally. I know a lot of people work with a lot of non-native species that are not invasive, and so I like to make sure that we make this distinction between invasive and non-native. So the other part of the definition is that it causes some sort of environmental, economic, or harm to human health. And so, those are actually the things that we're concerned about when we are talking about invasive species. So I'm sure many of you have heard of giant hogweed. It was even on Yahoo News. I didn't know Yahoo News actually had important news on it, but this was actually pretty interesting. They were talking about how someone was gardening and came into contact with hogweed, which is, we find quite a bit here in New York State, and ended up with burns after they were exposed to sunlight and severe burns across their body. We also sometimes forget that we have invasive mosquitoes that carry very serious diseases like Zika virus. We forget that the black rat is not necessarily native and carries diseases. We have other diseases that are not native that are decimating our bat populations. And we're even finding that some invasive shrubs are related to, are associated with Lyme's disease and increased tick populations. The economic impact of invasive species are twofold. First of all, we have the actual loss associated with the invasive species. So for example, spotted-winged Drosophila, which many of you may be familiar with here in New York State, was projected by Cornell to have $7 million worth of fruit loss. It lays its eggs in nice, very beautiful berries that you're looking to pick. And then a couple of days later, when you're home and ready to eat them, you see a little container full of larvae. So you can imagine the impact that has on crops. But we also have loss to fisheries in the Great Lakes. The sea lamprey greatly reduced our sport fish populations. As you can see, they latch on and end up killing them. We have other impacts in our forests, which are very significant when we have to cut loose trees that are valuable for timber, such as ash and so on. And then the other part of and also even invasive species in lakes, we see property values going down significantly when the lakes are all clogged up with species and no one can boat or swim in them. And then there's the second part of the equation of the economic impact is that impact of the cost that the money we're spending to control them. And so, there's an estimate of 167 billion. I think that number was put out by Cornell in 2005. And really, we have a very hard time quantifying those impacts, but they are significant and they are difficult to manage. And then, and this is kind of my area. I worked in conservation biology for many years, and so this is kind of the impact that I think about and I'm most intrigued by, and that's the ecological impact of invasive species. They're associated with reduced biodiversity, and they're actually considered the second greatest threat next to loss of habitat impacting species. You see many invasive species are endangering species that we care about. Here in New York State, we have swallowwort encroaching on the hartstongue fern, just an hour north of here. And we have other instances of species hybridizing, non-native species, invasive species hybridizing with native, and we're losing those populations as well. It disrupts ecosystem functioning, and also disrupts specialized relationships. And I love to point out this work of Doug Tallamy. He wrote the book Bringing Nature Home. You may be familiar with that because it's related to your field, where he really points out these really specific interactions. And these photographs are Dr. Tallamy's. He's an amazing photographer. If you ever get a chance to see a presentation by him, please go out of your way to do it. But we have these very specific interactions between insects and their host plants. Sometimes, like the monarch butterfly, they depend on one specific species to complete their life cycle. And so when we change that by introducing non-native species, we actually lose that. And he did some really cool research. He was actually telling me about it when he was here in Ithaca a couple of years back, where he went out and he had his grad students and interns collect all the species they could find on native species, and then all the insect species they could find on native species, and all the ones they could find on ornamental plants. So these aren't even invasive species necessarily, they're just non-native in a landscaped yard. And as you can see, he's looking at native Lepidoptera. On an oak, he found 518 species. And when you get down to the crepe myrtle, 3. And so I put this is also a photo by Dr. Tallamy. As you can see, these species are important not just for their existence, but they support a food web, such as birds feeding their young and so on. And so he says here, alien ornamentals support 29 times less biodiversity than native ornamentals. So I'd like to shift gears a little from the impacts to invasive species here in New York State. Right now, I'm at invasives, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. Every year, their number changes because we have more species, partially due to more reporting and partially due to more species coming in. Right now, they have 407 species that are varying levels of invasiveness in their database, and that has gone up every year that I've asked them. And one thing notable about here in New York State is we have more forest pests than any other state in the US. And this is very significant because forest pests are really the only invasive species that can, or the only impact that can virtually wipe out tree species within a matter of decades. So, and this is one that I focus on quite a bit because it's one that has such clear impacts, and we have many forest pests in New York, 62, I believe, to be exact, such as hemlock woolly adelgid, emerald ash borer, and oak wilt, southern pine beetle, chestnut blight, which has already wiped out our chestnuts, and the list goes on. Just for example, I just wanted to highlight one or two. It came in from Asia, and it's been here since 2002 in the US, spread to New York, and really we're about to lose all of our ash trees. Now you're starting to see why us invasive species folk don't get invited places to give talks. But, tens of millions of ash trees have been lost, and it's spreading across the state of New York. However, I will go back to say there are solutions being sought out for this. So it's not necessarily just a lost hope. We may lose all our ash. We have gene banks where we have programs that are collecting seeds. We're looking for resistancy in ash to try to see if we can find those individuals that are resistant. And we also have a very advanced biological control program that will hopefully start kicking in and helping some of these ash survive. So I don't want to be all negative about that. But there is another species, and I specifically point this out here because I want you all to be aware of it. Since you're out a lot, it's really important that we have a lot of eyes out there looking for this species. It's called the spotted lanternfly, and it was introduced into Pennsylvania back in 2014. It came in on slabs of granite that were imported from Asia. And since then, it has become a pest like we never imagined it would be down in Pennsylvania. There's quarantines trying to keep it out. It had been invasive in South Korea, and they've never even seen the kind of behavior that we're seeing here or the population expansion. It is attacking grapes, apples, hops. It doesn't necessarily eat the fruits. It actually just excretes a honeydew on them that makes them unsellable afterwards. And even with pesticides, the population is so large that they can't keep them off. And so right now we're actually having like a look out here in New York. We're trying very hard to contain it down in Pennsylvania and not let it across our borders because those crops are very important to our economy as well. But I'd like to bring it up because I know many of you are out and about and would have an opportunity to see this, and it's very difficult to miss. As you can see, this red on its wings, and it kind of clumps up like this, and I wish I had brought the video because it's pretty disgusting. Yes?
Is it eating the foliage?
No, it's actually sucking the phloem, I believe, and I'm not an entomologist. But what roots the grapes are cheaper. It excretes this honeydew.
So it's not going to wipe out the invasive grapes that are...
No.
Okay. Yeah.
And more just makes the fruit where you can't sell it, and it weakens the plants, and the plants have less productivity. I was just down in Pennsylvania 2 weeks ago for a workshop, and they are up in arms. They don't know what to do about it. So keep an eye out for it, and do report it to the DEC if you find it. We also have a lot of aquatic invasives here in New York State. Many of you have heard about Cayuga Lake hydrilla. We have northern snakehead, which we're trying very desperately not to let spread. A new invasive species, this clumpy green thing here, is stony starwort. And starry stonewort, I always forget this. It's like a tongue twister. But it's an algae that forms like layer upon layer upon layer. There's no control method known, and it's been a huge problem in the Midwest for a few years, and recently started becoming problematic here in New York State. And just I put up here zebra mussels as well. But just to tell you a little bit, just an example of the cost of hydrilla here in New York. I was talking with the aquatic invasive species coordinator for the state. She said they've spent over $15 million just for treatments since 2011, and it's only found in a couple of locations. And so you can imagine the costs involved in trying to prevent lakes being choked out the way they are in Florida. And we, of course, have our terrestrial species. I just put a few. We've got hundreds of them. One of the big challenges we've been dealing with is swallowwort, pale and black swallowwort, which is very difficult to control and spreading rapidly, and Phragmites and many of the invasive shrubs that you may be familiar with. And I just wanted to point out earthworms as a terrestrial species that I think we need to be thinking about a little more here, and that IMAP invasives has actually been trying to, our database here in New York has been trying to collect more information on. You know, people think a lot of times that, first of all, earthworms are native, which in this area we don't have any native earthworms. For a little farther south, we do have a couple of species. But our earthworms here are not native. And while they may be good for aerating soils, so the farmers say, they're really bad for forests. And some recent research here at Cornell that's been going on, and in other places has shown that it reduces leaf litter, it leaves the soil and the forest dry and mineralized, and they've actually seen a decline in plant species diversity and an increase in invasive plant species. And the decrease in the soil moisture has also resulted in decrease in arthropods, which has impacted salamanders and ground-nesting birds, and so on and so forth. And so there is this concern, and there's actually, you can report it. If you find invasive earthworms, you can report it, and we're really looking to better understand their distribution. So those of you who are digging a lot, you probably see it, and it's also a big deal for people who are selling plants that are potted with soil or selling mulch, because that's how it's one of the main ways it's spread. So,
Carrie,
yeah?
you need to tell them, because the one you're talking about is a big one.
With it?
Yes.
Well, crazy worm, actually, they're all damaging. There's European earthworms here as well. The crazy worm is the one that's going to be wriggling and jumping all over the place and like kind of gross you out because it's all wiggly. But there are species of European ones. You're right, though, the one that they're actually really looking for reporting in the database is the Asian jumping worm or crazy snake worm or whatever else they call it. But yeah, it's pretty obvious when you find it. And so, you know, we have these invasive species, they're problematic, and then we have other things that are happening and that are impacting our ecosystems that are actually also helping invasive species spread further. I will get to the good part eventually, or the solution part. So climate change is something that everybody's hearing about, obviously, everywhere you go, on the news, and so on. And climate change is really interesting because we're seeing and we're just learning and really starting to gather data on how it's impacting invasive species. And I could give a whole hour talk on that. And so I'm just going to quickly go through a few of the ways the rising temperatures allowing invasives they adapt quickly. Okay, it's an earlier spring, I'll leave out earlier. And you can see that, I'm sure, when you're out in the woods and those first green leaves in the understory, those are usually invasive species. So they react, and then they gain the advantage, where the native species don't have that plasticity to do so. They're also expanding their range. They're moving north. They can live farther north now. They can survive the winters. Also, we've got storms that are creating disturbances, which invasive species love, that they adapt to disturbances. And also this interesting little picture, and I hate to breeze over this because I like this study so much. They looked at increased CO2 levels in the lab, and what they showed was that, this is a thistle, and I can't remember what species it is, but that when you have higher CO2, invasive species can respond to that and grow faster than native species, even in the same higher CO2. And beyond that, they're even more resistant to herbicides. So it's a really interesting, it'll challenge the way we manage a lot of these weeds in both agriculture and natural settings. And we're already seeing like the range of the Hemlock-Lilea delicate. Nobody ever thought it could live in the Adirondacks because it's too cold, surviving the winters, and it's moving north. And if you look at, it's just kind of like a march north that we've been seeing it move up, and it's able to survive winters, and it's adapting to the cold spells. And unfortunately, this is happening with a number of other species as well. And predictions have shown, and this is from Jenica Allen from UNH and Bethany Bradley from UMass, and predictions are showing that the Northeast will kind of be a hot spot in the future for new invasions. So we really need to keep an eye out and be proactive about not introducing these species that we thought were harmless into the environment. And there's another cool study that was done by Steve Frank down in North Carolina. And he was even looking at, and this is relevant for you all in your field as well, he was looking at gloomy scale insects, who they're not introduced species, they're native species. And he was looking at using cities that are slightly warmer and drier, the same kinds of conditions that we expect in some regions due to climate change, compared to slightly cooler outside the city and slightly moister, and was finding that the scales like had an explosion in their population, and even in a couple of degree warmer environment and climate, and then they started negatively impacting the trees. So there's going to be pests that aren't, and we call these sleeper species. They're species that are there hanging out, and under new climate conditions, they're allowed to explode. So, another change that we're seeing in our environment and impact that we're seeing on our lives, both in our gardens and in our forests, are the increase in white-tailed deer populations. And this has been a steady rise for decades now, due to decreased hunting, due to better conditions for them to survive, due to warmer winters. And, you know, we're not really thinking about, we see what they do in our gardens, but we're not always thinking about what they're doing when they're out in the woods. This is taken at night, and these are native oak seedlings that were planted as part of an experiment. And I love when he looks at the camera because he got caught on film, he got busted. But so you can see how quickly one deer in a couple of seconds can really take down native vegetation. And they're kind of picky eaters. As you can see probably from your gardens, they don't really like a lot of the invasive species or introduced species. And so, you know, and I can go into much more detail on this too, but what I just wanted to show you is that they're also helping invasive species spread. So we've done, some researchers here at Cornell, Andrea Davos and Van Blassie, as well as many others, have done fencing experiments where they fence out the deer and they see, compare what happens inside and outside. And what you can see is that actually this really invasive species that we consider highly problematic here in New York, the biomass is reduced significantly when it's inside the fence, when the deer are left out, because the deer aren't eating all the native vegetation. And actually, if we went deeper into the study, it would show that we get the trillium do better. We have more native species inside the fence and outside the fence. I actually have a picture, and I didn't include it in here, where you can see the stilt grass growing right up to the fence line. And then it stops, and you see mixed vegetation on the inside. And so, you know, we've got not only the species here, but we have all these facilitating factors that are helping them spread. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk, as we're speaking about solutions for invasive species, we need to really think about how are they getting here to begin with, right? So I mean, that's the first place to start. So a lot of them have been introduced purposefully, intentionally over the years, because we thought they'd be good for securing erosion along stream sides, such as with tamarisk, as you can see in that picture. It's done much more than secure the soil on the stream side. We've also introduced them, like the Shakespeare enthusiasts introduced many invasive birds we have here today from Europe because they were mentioned in Shakespeare's books, like the starling, European starling, house sparrow. This is a flock of starlings, as you probably have seen quite frequently in the fall. And also, at some point, we actually used to do like just experiments where we'd throw out new species into the field to see if they'd control another species without screaming or anything. That's not the case nowadays. Such as the cane toad that was introduced into Australia and now is completely taken over Australia. If you have a chance to see that video, it's really funny. Just research, you know, movie on cane toads. It's a real funny movie, and it's really shocking of what they've done. But you know, a lot of what we're seeing now are not intentional introductions, but we're still seeing a lot of introductions. We see species coming in through ballast water ships, in packing materials, on plants and produce transport, and those that have come in through the pet trade and brand trade and have escaped. And so those are the main unintentional pathways that we're still seeing a lot of species come in on. And so since it's trade that's driving a lot of these introductions, we need to think about trade, the situation of trade today. And we've actually seen a four-fold increase in shipping during the past 20 years, and a threefold increase in air travel over the past 20 years. And it's just a phenomenal amount of travel and transport of goods, allowing species to come in, which really makes our work challenging to keep them out. And I've had people say, oh, won't they run out? Like, I mean, we have so many now. Aren't they likely to, you know, the number that we're going to get introduced is going to go down, so we don't need to be quite as vigilant or anything. And in fact, Sandy Leopold from the Forest Service did a really interesting study where he showed that even though we're depleting, and this is just on wood-boring insects, or bark beetles. It's one of those. He took all those, but this actually translates across taxa. That we think, okay, we've just treated the pool of species that could potentially be introduced, but the acceleration of imports and the likelihood that they could make it here shows that we won't be getting a break anytime soon from having new introductions. So this is an area that we really have to be super attentive to. In New York, actually, we are pretty vulnerable here to new introductions. We have a lot of goods coming in, the second highest volume of goods in wood packaging. 23% of the plants that enter the country come through New York. And New York is actually a pretty similar biome, pretty similar conditions to the source of a lot of our shipped goods, which is Asia. And so we're a temperate zone, and they can get here. And so getting here is just a piece of the battle, is being able to establish. So if we have good conditions and matching conditions from their home range, we can actually allow them to establish. And they also are coming in from other states, so I don't want to say it's just coming in through shipping. So, we had Oakville coming from the Midwest, CAB, and many others. So back in 2000, all right, I'm getting to the solutions part, guys. Here we go. Back in 2003, Governor Pataki put together an invasive species task force. He knew it was a big problem here in New York and wanted to do something about it. So, some of the people on the task force were right here at Cornell. And a couple years later, they published 12 recommendations. And I won't go through each of these recommendations, but what I can say about these recommendations, and I'll talk a little bit about some of them, is that they've all actually been implemented, which you don't always see a report come out and then people take action and actually do the recommendations. So that was part of the battle here in New York. And one of them, the permanent leadership structure. And I actually see an advisory committee member here, which is very nice. We have an Invasive Species Council, which takes a lot of the decisions about the path we're going to take here in New York. It's made up of the 9 state agencies. It's co-chaired by the DEC and the Department of Ag and Markets. And it looks at invasive species issues, prioritizes funding, recommends legislation, and they're advised by the Invasive Species Advisory Committee. And they give information to the council and help make recommendations on decisions they should make. And it's made up of 25 members, including people from industries. And so it's been really important over time to make sure industry is involved. And you have industry representatives that are on the advisory committee. So it's great to be involved. We've seen a lot more industry participation, and it really helps balance our decisions about invasive species when we have that kind of input. And so we also have our boots on the ground here in New York, the Partnerships for Regional Invasive Species Management, called the PRISMs. There's 8 of them. They cover the whole state. Each PRISM, it used to be they just had a full-time coordinator. Now they actually have staff and interns, and they're out there trying to get people to work together and prioritize invasive species management and do it, and also educate and outreach to the public about different invasive species issues. And what's really cool about this is actually we're like one of the only states in the region, actually in much of the US, that has this comprehensive coverage where we have people out on the ground. This makes my job really easy because I have all these contact points that then have their groups, and so we can actually put invasive species responses into action within this system. In Florida, for example, they actually have thousands of species. I always thought we had a lot of invasive species here in New York, and then I went to Florida for a workshop in February, and then I felt stupid because I was like, oh, we have 400 species in our database. So yeah, we have thousands. And they have this comprehensive system with unpaid individuals that it's like 10% of their job working on it. So even if you see that some of the other states have PRISMs that cover it, it's actually, New York has been very proactive in making sure that this program is funded. And part of this program is also a comprehensive database, and this is really important for people who are out in the field and understand plant identification and insect identification, or even just want to learn about it, to be able to report what you're seeing or do surveys and identify the distribution of some of these species. A lot of them are new. We really depend on citizen scientists to provide some of this information, because we can't pay people to be everywhere all the time trying to report this data. So there's trainings all the time. They go around the state. You can do them online. If you're interested, just type in IMAP Invasive New York and you can get information. And then part of this system as well, a recommendation was the formation of the Invasive Species Research Institute, which is the institute that I direct. And the purpose of the institute is to communicate and coordinate invasive species research to help prevent and manage the impact of invasive species in New York and beyond. So if the information is out there, I'm coordinating webinars and conferences. The CCA in-service in the fall has an invasive species track that I coordinate. Also making sure that researchers are communicating their information. And then also I talk to the people out on the ground that are dealing with invasive species to find out what is it that they need to know? What are their hardest hit species they're dealing with, or where are the information gaps, so then I can coordinate and promote researchers to actually do that research. So I'm more of the research institute that doesn't have a staff of a bunch of research scientists, but depends on its network and collaborations to get things done. So this is what it looks like. This is all funded through the New York State Environmental Protection Fund. And so it has a continuous funding line, which it has been essential in moving these efforts forward. And just so maybe you recognize some faces in there. And so what are these prisms doing? Well, they're doing prevention, detection, and management of invasive species. So ranging from promoting regulations and advising on prohibited and regulated species, to trying to detect species early and getting out there, to washing boats and coming up with new solutions and training volunteers and so on. So it wouldn't be an invasive species presentation if we didn't bring up the invasive species curve. How many people have seen this invasion curve? So good presentation. Okay, so the curve is how it helps us frame our thinking for invasive species management. So here at the bottom, you can see you're catching, it'd be prevention. Catching the species before it gets here. Understanding those pathways that I just talked about. And the control costs for that, as you can see, are the lowest. So as you go up the curve, the area infested by the invasive species increases, it's over time, and the control costs increase, and also the likelihood of managing or eradicating the species decreases. And so what we like to do is prevent. As we get farther up, eradication becomes more difficult. So early detection, we want to try to get it when it's in this yellow period. So in this yellow part of the curve, so we can actually have a chance of controlling it. But then once it's widespread, like many of the species you know, barberry or emerald ash borer or so on and so forth, we really just are managing our assets. We're protecting this tree or this pond, but we're not ever going to get rid of it unless we come up with a longer term solution, which I'll talk about afterwards as well. Oh, I'm going backwards. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have we're targeting the pathways. And so I'd like to go into a little bit of detail about a couple of these. First of all, we have a boat washing program here in New York State that's been expanding, and what we're trying to do is prevent the spread of invasive species from one lake to another. So this is just an example of a way that we've been working. We have lakes in the Adirondacks that have no invasive species at all. So we want to keep the invasive species out of those lakes, and we want to contain them just where they're at so that we can keep them in one spot. We also have, as of a couple of years ago, how many of you are familiar with the regulated and prohibited species? Okay, so a number of you. So I'm going to shift just really quickly. This is not, you're going to see it's not my presentation because I usually don't talk about the ins and outs of the legislation, but I wanted just to share a little bit of additional information for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So as of 2015, so this presentation was passed on to me by Dave Adams. He is the coordinator for the invasive species section at the Department of Environmental Conservation here in New York. And so we have two types of species on this list. We have prohibited species, which is completely illegal to possess, import, purchase, transport, or introduce. And then we have regulated invasive species. So you really can't introduce it into the wild, and I'm not going to go into all the definitions here, but you can keep it yourself if you want to. You can sell it and buy and transport as long as it's kind of controlled. And there should be labels on these regulated species, so if you're using them for landscaping, you can certainly get more information from the DEC or the Department of Ag and Markets on this, but you actually do need to put a label on them, and a written notice must be provided to clients that these species are regulated and that they are invasive. If you want to use the prohibited species, you can apply for a permit. It's not always, you have to have a good reason for it apparently, for research or education or other approved activities. But so there are some exceptions apparently that I don't know what these would be, but you could try. And they're also working on cultivars where they're trying to approve certain cultivars for some of the most used invasive landscaping plants, ones that aren't able to reproduce and that are sterile. And so there are some options that are being developed by researchers, and I think some of them have already been introduced. I know I was on the committee that was looking at some of these, and so I know for barberry and some other grasses, they have approved some cultivars here in New York State. And so this, and actually I'm going to drop these off for you. There are booklets on the plants and the animals, but you can also get them on the DEC website in PDF version. And there's also, presentations and frequently asked questions, so there are resources for you. And this is Dave's personal contact information. I don't know whether he'd direct you to Ag and Markets or not, but you can certainly reach out to the DEC or Ag and Markets for more info. So. I will say there are a couple of things about this before I finish, is that they are regulating, preventing species from being spread within the state of New York or potentially coming into New York. But they don't keep species out of the country. None of our current activities for prevention here in New York State are preventing the next emerald ash borer from coming in from Europe. There are some federal and many of you probably know this if you're working in the plant world, that there are restrictions on which plants can come in if they think they're going to be invasive. They do inspections. There are certain treatments that, I mentioned wood pallets are a big source of forest pests, and as well as woody plants within the same genera as North American plants. Those are the big risks right now. There are some treatments in place, and there's a question about whether they're effective enough, as we still continue to get new species. And so I won't go into the federal part today, but that is an important aspect that New York should expand its focus to. So the next part on the curve is this yellow part that I talked about. And it's kind of like finding a needle in a haystack a lot of the time. If you're gonna find a species before its population has grown enough, you need to catch it early. You need to be out there, but it's really hard to find these small plants or the first insect. And so here in New York, we are employing a lot of ways of finding it. We've been training volunteers. New York has a really cool drone program where they're actually looking at forest health. They're using Landsat data collected from satellites to detect early infestations in some of these forest pests. We have David Lodge here at Cornell. He's a top researcher working with environmental DNA, where you can take a water sample and detect whether an invasive species is in that water body or whether an endangered species is in that water body. So, and we've also even been exploring working with conservation dogs who are excellent at finding things early. And in fact, if you're here planning on going to the Cornell Department of Extension in-service, we're going to have a whole session on how you can employ conservation dogs for detection of invasive species or for research. So just if it's something that interests you. And then finally, there's long-term management. What time did I start, since I didn't start on time?
Just give you 5 more minutes.
5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, sure, okay. So the last part is what we're looking at as far as solutions is, all right, what do we do when there's actually a huge population and it's widespread across the state? So we consider our control actions. We can spray them, we can remove them physically, or we can introduce a natural predator that only feeds on that species in order to control it. And that's actually what we consider a long-term solution. And I'll touch it a little bit more on some of the projects we have coming in New York State. But these species that come in that are introduced as biocontrols are very carefully screened and have been tested to make sure they don't eat anything or reproduce on anything but the invasive that it's targeted to. So I just wanted to go back a little bit and just talk about some of the initiatives that the New York Invasive Species Research has going on and the kinds of things we're doing to help promote better and more informed invasive species prevention, control, and early detection. So what we've been really focusing on a lot is, we do all these control methods, but a lot of times we don't know whether we're actually successful. This is kind of a problem for invasive species management because we get funding to manage them, and the funding doesn't allow for post-treatment monitoring. And an example of this, and I don't want to pick on the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, but they actually spent 25, actually now it's 30 million for Phragmites. Phragmites is, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with that, a wetland plant that's very problematic and widespread and hard to control. But they spent almost 30 million over a 5-year period to control Phragmites, and there were no reports included in that funding of whether it was successful or not. They only reported the amount they sprayed, the number of people they employed, the area they covered, and there's no funding in it for them to do that. So one of our partners from the Adirondack, Chris and Brendan Curran, he went out and they measured with not GLRI funding, with their own funding. They went out and they monitored all the sites where they were controlling Phragmites. And what they found was if you had a patch that was bigger than the front of this room, you had like a 0 probability of ever eradicating it. And so he partnered with researchers here at Cornell to do that statistical analysis and came to that conclusion. But that really helps guide, some of the management for Phragmites. Because we know if we have a huge stretch of Phragmites, we're not going to really get rid of it. So if that's our goal, we should change our objectives. And so, like I said, knowing whether we reached our goal, we can't know by the amount we've removed. We only can know whether the thing that we're helping to protect, like our trillium, are there. So we need to start thinking about how we measure success. We've been partnering with state parks and promoting researchers to partner. This is Dr. Andrea Davalos from SUNY Cortland. She's been helping state parks to measure whether their swallowwort control has been effective. And so they've been doing all these different methods, and now she's going out and helping them see whether they're actually reaching their goals and whether they should continue doing that. We've also mentioned a lot of species, and it's really hard to make decisions about which of those species we should manage and which of those we should not manage. And so we've been working with some computer scientists and with Dr. Angela Fuller, and we hired a postdoc, Jen Priceback, who's with that cute little fawn in her arms, and they are taking all of this information and trying to develop a model that can help guide our decision making and help us optimize our invasive species management in New York State. Another thing that the Research Institute's been doing is we've been working with researchers, a lot of them here at Cornell, to promote their getting funding and to promote them working on new biological control agents for some of our most problematic species. You guys may have heard of Mark Whitmore's biocontrolled Hemlock-Woolly Adelgid lab here at Cornell. That's been a really growing program that's funded through the Department of Environmental Conservation, and we've also recently released for the first time, you may have seen it in the news, we released for the first time an insect from the Ukraine that was approved for swallowwort biocontrol here in New York State. We're also developing biocontrols here in the Blassie lab to control water chestnut, which is a very problematic aquatic species, and also Phragmites. And so and I won't get into details on it, but once you get an effective biocontrol, the rest of it starts working for itself. And so it reduces the population enough so your native species can come back, so you can swim in your lake, and so on. So if you can get the right match, then it actually is a sustainable solution. Another issue that we've been working with, I mentioned how climate change is impacting invasive spreads. But one of the things that, that we don't really know, we don't know how we can incorporate that knowledge into our management plans. And so even in the executive order, that was the amendment to the executive order on invasive species, mandating that we consider climate change and invasive species management, nobody really knows how to do that. So we developed the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Initiative together with the Northeast Climate Science Center and Dr. Bethany Bradley. And we've been really bringing together researchers and managers in taking a lead in helping guide people to do that. We've also been working with researchers to help share information on the new technologies for early detection. So we coordinated a workshop with Dr. David Lodge, and we'll be also coordinating on environmental DNA. We'll also be coordinating one on remote detecting of invasive species. And then we also work to solicit and synthesize expert opinions and make recommendations to the council or to the DEC and other management leaders in the state about what the science is saying, so they can include that in their decision making. And finally, kind of my favorite part of it all is this idea that innovation is going to be the solution. And the director of the National Invasive Species Council is Dr. Jamie Rees, who's pictured here, and she really has promoted, let's think across disciplines, let's think outside the box, and let's look for new solutions. They had an innovation summit about a year and a half ago trying to bring together these new ideas. And I really feel like, here at Cornell and in our universities is a place where a lot of that innovation can happen. So it's really exciting to think about new solutions. And I guess that's what, among the doom and gloom of invasive species world, I really see that as a little glimmer of hope in helping us really advance this. So just on your own time, if you're looking for things that you would like to do to reduce invasive species spread, if you're from here in New York, you can join your local PRISM. There's always things to do, volunteer days. You can learn to identify some of the invasives and enter them into the database. Make sure you clean, dry, and dry your boat, brush your shoes off so you're not spreading these invasives, and Doug Talman would be happy to know you plant native species in your yard or sell them in your garden store or whatever. So that's about it. Thank you so much, and hopefully you'll invite invasive species people back in the future.
Maybe one or two questions if we have it while we're getting set up for our next speaker.
It didn't sound like you had very many success stories. Like you were really hopeful and helpful. It feels like from a layman's, it's like, oh, the purple, the blue stripe. Like, it sounds like, what's that? Was like covered and now it's not even there. So that's like from the regular, it sounds like.
That's a huge success story. That's why actually, I survey, as I mentioned, I feel like, what are the things that you would like to see research doing to help you do a better job? And biocontrols is not on top every time. Most of my top projects focus on developing biocontrols because when they're successful, like purple loosestrife, I did my master's research on purple loosestrife back in 2002. And then I moved out of the country for 11 years. And when I came back, and I did it on purple loosestrife because it was everywhere. It was a huge problem, and we wanted to understand what it was doing to native wildlife. When I came back, nobody even talks about purple loosestrife anymore. That's how effective the biocontrol program was. Like little patches pop up here and there. Beekeepers do not like that because there's such a beekeeper in there. I apologize. I know that it's a sensitive topic because it is so successful that they're actually losing some of their species. But there are some instances of poison. I know maybe I didn't focus enough on the solution, but
What insect is being released for the swallow wart?
it's Hyena ambulanta. It's a moth. It was found in Ukraine, and it went through all the rigorous testing for about 10 years, I think, of research and the specificity testing and approvals before it could be released. So it was pretty exciting when it finally was able to be released. So now we're dealing with the challenges of mastering it and getting it out there and to see if it actually works.
Where has it been released?
It's been released in a couple of state parks, really. It's a big problem up in the north of the state, off of Lake Ontario. Right now it's in the experimental stage because we don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, we know it's not going to eat anything else. We don't know whether it's actually going to survive in the New York climate, reproduce, and ultimately reduce the population of swallowtail, which is what we're trying to do. So we're testing it now. It takes a long time to get it to the point where you can actually release it. The blue stripe has already gone through that same process, and now it's yes.
Do you have any updates on the lily leaf beetle? Which I really see moving through New York State.
So there is a biocontrol, and being released, and it's being monitored. And from what I've heard from the researchers, they are having success. I don't know whether that is, so the thing with biocontrol is one of those things you need a lot of patience because it takes a long time to actually establish a population in the wild and then have that population be big enough where it can reduce the other population. But from what I've heard, and I can give you further information if you want it, you can take my card, and I can connect you with people who are, on the network.
And it's Brian's project.
Oh, great.
So,
Perfect.
yeah, good information.
You
Yeah,
did a
we
good
are-
job on covering.
We're
Is that
optimistic
okay?
about it. Yeah.
All right.
So where did they found them from the larvae that you covered them. Do you know which site it was? Somebody asked me that. the other day.
Yeah, in Hudson Valley.
Okay. So we have recovered the parasitoid from larvae in the Hudson Valley that were released last year.
So they survived the winter, so we're optimistic they'll establish population here.
Check back with us in maybe 10 years.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank Carrie.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.